Greetings, friends. All summer long, Disciples Justice Ministries will be sharing a series of conversations between justice leaders under the theme Facing Brokenness, Being Brave Together. There'll be 4 conversations total, each one focusing on a particular topic: the church, our communities, the world, and creation. Tonight's conversation centers around church. My name is Brian Frederick Gray, and in addition to being Mission Director for Disciples Peace Fellowship, I'm also the co-facilitator for the Disciples Justice Ministries cohort group, along with my friend and colleague, the Reverend Dr. Lori Pound-Fail. This series of conversations comes out of work that Disciples Justice Ministries has been doing all year long, striving to address the dual threats of online radicalism and white nationalism. Those conversations started up in our group in late 2020, and following the attack on the United States Capitol on January 6th, 2021, we redoubled our efforts. In this conversation, you'll be hearing our panelists reflect on where they see brokenness, what can happen to bring about wholeness, and where they're finding hope right now. Tonight's panelists include April Johnson from Reconciliation Ministry, Ken Booker-Langston from the Disciples Center for Public Witness, Alex Ruth from Disciples Men, and Jack Sullivan from the Disciples Justice Action Network. Make sure to stick around to the very end of the video because we'll have a tangible takeaway that you can do to help make a difference in the world as we work to be brave together. In fact, we'll have one of those Being Brave Together sections at the end of each video in this series. On behalf of your siblings in faith at Disciples Justice Ministries, welcome to the conversation. And without further ado, let's get to that opening question.
Where do you see brokenness? For me, is the January 6th Capitol insurrection. That was an obvious witness to brokenness, showing a hyper violent and our hyper vigilance, resistance to change. And it also promotes a narrative that is being disrupted and dismantled, despite those of us who are resistant to change. And that is a narrative, obviously, of white supremacy. That was one event, but it did not happen on January 6th. It was a build-up to creating otherness. And so anything other than this white dominant narrative that whiteness is the height of human hierarchy, as if the God that we serve created human hierarchy.
Okay. I was thinking of 3 areas I'll go through rather quickly, I hope, of brokenness in terms of fragmentation taking place in our church as a whole. There's lots of it actually, but I just want to concentrate on 3 quickly. One is the area of witness. And here I'm talking about where personal salvation is pitted against social justice. The truth of the matter, obviously, is that the whole gospel is about both personal and social transformation. So I think one of the main villains here is probably excessive individualism. And I think the thing that happens is that people confuse individuality with individualism. I think the gospel affirms individuality, that each of us is created in the image of God and has infinite worth because of that. But individualism is a place where every individual can assert him, her, or their self, even if it's at the expense of other people. So in this way, individualism contributes to the fragmentation of the church. It severely limits our witness to the world, and it undermines our claim that we as church are one body of Christ. The other place is identity. Well, actually, what I just said could count as ecclesiology, so I'll leave that for ecclesiology, the way that the excessive individualism undercuts the way to put autonomy together with mutual accountability.
And my mentor, the late Dr. Paul A. Crow Jr., would always say, autonomous, to use that language, represents a scandalous way of functioning. Autonomy is scandal. because we are not autonomous. We are connected to God through Christ. He is the vine, we are the branches. Apart from Christ, we can do nothing. Also, we are made to be with and for one another. We're not free agents in the system called church. No, we are connected to one another. Each one of us is valuable and needed by other parts to be the whole body that we are we have been designed to be.
The third thing is identity. I think in this church, unity means our identity is the church of unity. It means inclusion instead of true mutuality based on equity. So in this church, white Christians basically own the table, and they invite or leave out whoever they please. So we may allow people of color to sit at the table, maybe even at the head of the table, but we still deep down believe, feel, and continue to act as though we think we own this table. And in doing that, we ignore our basic theological claim that unequivocally it's the Lord alone who owns this table.
From the perspective of the work that I do with Disciples Men, for me, one of the areas that I see brokenness most evident is in the proliferation of a patriarchal framework. And April and Ken have talked to that in some ways, that especially Ken's comment that not only is it primarily viewed as a white issue, it's a white male issue. There are still lots of challenges that are placed before women in the church, women clergy, women in leadership, just women in general. That's a broken area in our world. And the issue with patriarchy is that it doesn't just affect women negatively or our non-binary siblings negatively. It impacts everyone negatively, regardless of your gender identity, regardless of sexuality and those things. It's a negative on the men in the world too, men in the church too. Patriarchy says that there's this system and men must be in this way, and that puts a lot of stress that we try to perform this role that we're not cut out for. It's a human role, not a divinely given image of God role.
Well, I'm sensing brokenness or experiencing it in the way that ignorance has been weaponized across the land, particularly as some of our legislators are enacting laws to ban the truth from being told about United States and global history. Specifically, I'm referring to increasing measures to ban the teaching of critical race theory and the 1619 Project's findings. Both of those essentially, to me, are just honest, truthful renditions of history that may be imperfect in some respects, but they offer perspectives that have not been presented in the academic arenas across the land. And there are those now who are working feverishly to prevent them from being taught, to prevent different, and I would say more truthful or honest perspectives to be shared about who we really were, and therefore who we really are as a society, as a people. And so this is dooming us to continued fragmentation and the continued abuses of power and privilege in our social, economic, and political realms. And it will cause us to repeat many of the sins and the errors and the omissions of the past.
If we don't know where we are, and if we don't know where we've come from, it's really hard to chart a course towards wholeness, even if we know what that looks like. It's kind of the point A to point B. If I'm not at point A, I'm not going to get to B because I'm headed in a trajectory that's not actually taking me there. I need to know where I am before I can get to where I want to go, which is why it is so essential that we own up to our history.
It makes me wonder, what are people so scared of or fearful of that they don't want to gain new perspectives on what took place historically and how that impacts who we really are right now?
I think people fear the same thing's going to be done to them that they've done to other people. Down deep is a fear that keeps people from wanting to move forward. It's a fear they don't want to move beyond ignorance. It's a fear that they don't want to hear the story that it really happened. There'll be a responsibility then that they feel like they've got to do something about, and they're afraid of what it might be that they have to do without. And I think it's because most folks are wrapped up in their white identity rather than their Christian identity. And it's the only identity they know, and they got to hold on to it tight.
Another one relates closely to what I mentioned, and it is the arrogance of power, where people in power, many of them who call themselves Christians, blatantly do not care about other people, about people whose needs remain unmet, who are not making enough money to thrive in our economy, who don't have access to adequate health care, people whose stories are not being told in our historical treatises. So it's more than getting people to understand that there are other perspectives and there are other issues and needs. It's getting them to care. And there are people who are saying over and over again, they just don't really care. Why? Because they have numbers on their side. They have power that comes from politics and social endeavors on their side, meaning that they don't have to care. You know, they can enact whatever laws or provisions that they want, and they can call it right. They can make their own weather. They can make their own value systems. And so that is a sure sign of brokenness, because there are people who are looking inside of the walls of human dignity where they are locked outside of them and have no access to that which confers dignity on everybody and worth that we believe in our realm as church people are God-given gifts of dignity and worth for all of us who are made in God's image and likeness. And very often there is no recognition of those persons' realities and perspectives and aspirations. And none of those is woven into the fabric of how we operate. It's a majority wins reality, even at work in the church, where I thought we were supposed to be motivated by love and justice and honor and integrity, all flowing from the Christ that we follow. But that does not always play out. And so very often people get to go on with their lives when they've misused power, but those who've been victimized by power end up being carried away on a stretcher and tainted forever in the eyes of the church. And so there's some real brokenness there.
You and I have talked about this before, but you know, church membership is seen more as being part about fellowship than about discipleship. And becoming a part of a congregation that's disciples does not require really anything beyond making the great confession. You know, coming down and saying Jesus is Lord and Savior, and He's the Christ, the Son of the living God. After that, it seems like you have freedom to do anything you want. And people get lost in freedom. You're not in church to be just free. It's the Spirit that sets you free. It's the truth that sets you free. And so I think it needs to require more than that. I think what we need to do is make people aware who are coming into the church or who are going through what they consider a conversion process to know what they're converting to know what they're becoming part of. And I mean, how in the world are we going to claim as disciples the essentials for a healthy church or in a healthy congregation and it's growing as deep Christian spirituality, true community, and a passion for justice if we don't have that up front? The minute they walk in the door, the minute they take a newcomer's class, the minute their children are in the school. I mean, that I think has to be done.
How do you or we work toward wholeness?
The image that comes to my mind is one that one of a shoe, one of my shoes that I've been walking along a path, and unbeknownst to me, I walk onto some discarded chewing gum. And then my walk for a long time is gummed up. I'm dragging and pulling the remnants of that chewing gum I walked on everywhere I go. And until I take the time necessary to ungum my shoe, until I do that, I'll forever be plagued by a gum shoe. I'll be slowed down from my destination.
One of our consultants, David Anderson Hooker, makes this comment in his speech at Duke several years ago that when you see a shooting star, it is long since burned out, right? I mean, well before you see it, it's already burnt out. And so what we are seeing in these activities, the insurrection on January 6th, this ecclesial practice of still limiting access to power. I think Jack said something about this ignorance, this proclivity toward promoting ignorance. Well, this agenda is based on a meteor, a shooting star of white supremacy that is long since died. And we're fighting against that. And so what we're seeing is the sparks of that fight of those who want to preserve these things that no longer make any sense, not to the next generation or the generation coming after, no longer makes sense to us. We cannot function in this way. So when we're doing anti-racism training through reconciliation, we are trying to move you from theory to praxis, not so we can feel embarrassed or preserve the fact that this is us versus them. This is truth versus non-truth. This is the truth. We stole this land. That's our truth. It's not just something for us to be embarrassed about. When you go to Australia, you get on any bus, you ask directions about anything, and they will tell you that's where the indigenous people were. And we have made reparations, and we continue to be trying to make reparations, not just financial, but reparations by acknowledging what we did when we came here. We have to acknowledge. And so part of our training, part of our granting program of reconciliation is to acknowledge who we are and where we are going.
We must shift our way of doing church away from a Eurocentric model. Even if we talk about inclusion and multiculturalism, we need to get away from that, from a Eurocentric model, and towards one where we affirm pluralism and real power sharing. We must see ourselves as equal partners in faith, as I like to say. If we don't, then we're just playing at church. We're not really involved in church. We have maybe an interest in justice. We don't have a passion for justice. I don't think we can have a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world if we have a fragmented gospel and a fragmented church. The church and the world are obviously interdependent, so we have to no choice but to work for wholeness at all times at both the church and the world level. But let me just say this: sometimes wholeness, like unity, can be like a big marshmallow that swallows everybody into it. And so we really have to make sure when we say wholeness, we don't mean uniformity or something like that, like unity often means. And we also have to make sure that we are not talking about fragmentation, that we're really using that as a word for diversity that we don't want. So that when it comes to disciples, we really need to have the kind of wholeness, authentic wholeness, we proclaim that recognizes, affirms, and works to enhance the many forms of diversity among us, thereby allowing this diversity to really be real and to enrich all of us as the body of Christ.
We have a system of being church that is baptized into whiteness, into white understandings of the world, white aspirations of church and the future, and none of those necessarily is evil or wrong, but they aren't the only perspectives. And we've often treated them as if they were the only show in town, the only way to function. And what I, as an African American leader, have picked up from that white trajectory is a system of church that values maintenance and fellowship. Disciples have an F group for everybody: youth, women, men, juniors, and we have groups who can create new fellowship groups if we want some. we love fellowship. I do too, especially the potlucks. But that's not why we're church. And so we have to figure out how we move away from this maintenance, comfort, non-conflict way of being church into one that's more consistent with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that involves critiquing who we have been and who we are, and coming up together with new ways of moving forward, allowing God to transform us, since we're going to try our best to be a collective, to transform us, all of us, into being a more faithful and effective church that it has at its heart the love of God made known through Christ, and that love had implications what we call social justice for our world, for our neighborhoods, and within our church.
So Jim Wallace and others have said is that although faith must be personal, it can never be private. So we have to be involved with history, with institutions, and with interpersonal dynamics, all of those things. They're not outside the purview of the gospel. They're not outside the range of transformation.
So many of our churches have been forced into a new way of doing church. We COVID-19 impacted all of us. Many of us were out for at least months. Some folks still, working out what it looks like to come back to an in-person gathering of church. And what we're finding is all of our structures are for that in-person experience. And that doesn't translate directly, at least, into a more virtual or online experience. And so we are at a cusp, I think, of a huge transformation in the way church happens, and that hopefully it can at least empower us to then move into some of these things that build wholeness and address areas of brokenness in our lives. We also live with this idea of scarcity. We live in a zero-sum mindset, so that people who have power, to give power away means that they have less power, and that they will then be abused by the people to whom they are giving power, where that's not the economy that we believe exists with God. Right. That there is always enough, that the cup overflows, that there is an abundance, that all people can have what they need to survive and thrive. So there's that redistribution, a zero-sum kind of thinking that holds us back.
I want to recommend to you all and to our listeners and our watchers at the watch party, Heather McGee is an economist who recently wrote her current book is called The Sum of Us. And I admittedly on this public forum failed Econ 101 because she was not my instructor. She is so good in explaining the practical application of how economics affects all of us, how it affects our thinking. And she starts with the analogy of draining the pools so that Black kids couldn't swim with white kids. And so with that analogy and then taking that to the zero-sum narrative that we all have imbibed, but what she shares throughout every chapter of her book is how white people do not benefit from the zero-sum proposition. We need to learn that, because all of us who are doing this work, particularly in my area of passion and expertise, is the fact that the reason why white supremacy prevails is because all of us are trying to get access and proximity to whiteness, whether you're white or not. And when we begin to dismantle this zero-sum proposition, we realize how it's not only failing those of us who are oppressed, it's failing those of us who promote it.
We also, and this is in keeping with the previous points, we have got to allow God to give us the antidote for the allergy that we have to accountability. I think part of our history is that we do not like to be accountable to anybody. That's why we like to be autonomous. And nobody from the region or general church or anywhere else can tell us what to do. And sometimes that anybody else includes Jesus. And we end up with church leaders who know more about Robert and his amazing rules of order than they do about the gospel of Jesus Christ and his value system concerning who we are and who we must be. And so it's hard then to mount a strategic approach to living if we are feeling that we are on our own and nobody can tell us about anything about who we are and what we got to do. We're not accountable to anybody. And so we are accountable to God and to each other. It's the loving system, not punitive, but it's a loving system that enables us to be sharper and stronger and better disciples of Jesus Christ, and not just church members who show up for an hour or so electronically or in person on a Sunday and see our friends, hear a word, and then go on with our life as if nothing we heard has anything to do with life in the real world.
Our next question is, where do you see hope?
Critically, cautiously, but I do see some signs of hope. One of the signs of hope is, and this needs to go much further, so don't get me wrong, I'm not saying these are great things, they need to go much further. It's the ongoing institutionalization of our commitment to being a pro-reconciling, anti-racist church. I've told some other people what we're doing in our denomination, and they cannot believe it. They're not that far along in their denomination at all. And I think Jack's right, it needs to be done more, and more and more and more. It also, I think, even needs to be done as part of like your introductory session once you come into the church as well. The things I was talking about, it just needs to be part of it. This is who we are. We've said it. Now here's what it's about.
I think that we're discovering that we're supposed to be a church that reaches out and goes out and takes risks. More of a venture capitalist church than being a credit union church that gives member services only and is low risk and more inwardly focused as an entity. And because I think we learned in the credit union model of being church, where we care about ourselves only or mostly, there was no growth for us in that model, no impact for us in that model, and no credibility for us in that model. But when we started taking risks, and when we began to see ourselves as being put in place by God through Christ to be agents of justice and wholeness and righteousness, I think that's when we discovered who we really are and who we really were supposed to be.
One of the areas where I think we work is to listen down. I'm Gen X. So many of our leaders are Gen X and still Boomer. And it's important for us to listen down to Gen Z, to the millennials, to Gen Alpha coming behind. What can we do, tangibly do, to help create the world that they want to see?
But I'm thinking about, I was in a meeting last night at church as a Bible study, and we were talking about who are you mentoring? Who are you bringing along? I remembered in that conversation last night that the people who are mentoring me are not the people who used to mentor me. They're the people that I've already mentored. They're the folks who are, sadly to say, 30 years my junior, who I introduced to an opportunity to be a leader in the church. And now they are mentoring me. They are saying, hey, what you are doing is you are chasing a shooting star that long since died out. Let me tell you what I think about transgender. your generation doesn't get, transgender identity. Let me tell you what that means. Let me tell you about identity being on a spectrum. No one taught me, my mentors didn't teach me that. The young generation is teaching me that understanding.
That ability to listen younger is important for us. I'm pushing 50, and there are times where I'm the youngest person in the room. That's just not healthy, because we got so much of our generation, so much of our friends and family, our fellow church members could be younger than us. It should be younger than us. So working down that age, listening to those who are younger than we are, I think it is an area that I'm seeing hope. I'm seeing that among more and more of my colleagues. Listening down to seminary students, finding out what's going on in their lives, and really helping us make a transition.
And so how am I accepting this call to justice that is inclusive? I'm asking the rest of the church and the world to be accountable to an inclusive narrative that we got from Jesus Christ. And yet I have to be willing to be challenged. So I just want to share that. And I believe, like, where I see hope are those young people who are calling me and saying, hey, it's great that you were oriented this way, but let me help you, move along into the reality of the context that we serve Jesus in, and that we want to bring you along in this process.
And I'm sensing us devising new partnerships ecumenically and in the interfaith and civic realm as well. And a lot of these new connections are being led by younger people. But I've seen some people in their 60s out there doing some new and bold things too. So God is doing a new thing, and it's multi-generational. And I'm so happy to say that this is happening now. So I'm happy to go to assembly now when I hear justice, not just in some back issue forum room, but I'm hearing justice being articulated on the main stage. And it's exciting to behold. And people are going home with new ideas, back to the communities with new purpose and new energy to be the church and not just go to one. And so I'm sensing that we're evolving, we're being transformed. And for me, that is a sign of hope.
Another thing I think is hopeful is that the disciples seem to be throwing their support behind something like the Poor People's Campaign. It's only one example, but it's an example of anti-racism in practice in a different kind of way. It brings people who would never, ever go to an anti-racist training to suddenly start thinking about issues of race. The fact that they've been divided, the fact that what hurts Black voters hurts poor white voters. All of this begins to be seen because of that work. Fusion politics, they call it.
And so what I'm realizing, where I see hope now, is that there's not the critical mass I would like to see, but there's enough people that are saying the benefit of white supremacy narrative costs too much. And I no longer want to subscribe to that. It's costing me my family. It's costing me my ability to be my authentic self. It's costing me in my proclivity to be able to give and to receive compassion and grace, as well as justice. What Ken was saying earlier about, if we were going to be honest, that quite possibly what's preventing us from moving into a just world is that those who participated in oppression, those who have imbibed this narrative of human hierarchy and oppression, are afraid that they're going to be victims of the very thing that they have promoted. And we don't have those conversations, and we have to have those conversations because it's costing not just those of us who get it, but those of us who benefit from it.
And I think, now I could be wrong here, but I think there's more and more white folks beginning to hear this message at least a little bit. And they're starting a little bit to see their identity more as Christian than as white. And they're starting to see how whiteness is devastating them, robbing them of their true possibilities and identity. And some of the folks, I think, are making a little bit of a turn. It's going to be slow. It's going to take some time, I think, but it's happening.
One of the other things that I think is helpful is there's becoming a new way of thinking about this notion of service that has been existent for so long. I was doing some research. I ran across an article, a hermeneutical article by a scholar by the name of Sandra Schneiders. And then she talks about the service of Jesus and around that farewell discourse in John's Gospel, the 15th chapter, I think. Jesus says, I call you my friends. You're no longer my servant, but you're my friend. And Snyder says that if we view those we are serving as our friends, we move past this, I've got it, or I need to get reimbursed for it. You know, I'll help you move if you'll help me when I need to move, those kinds of things. When they're our friends, we help them because they're in need, right? There's no reciprocal. I'm not worried about what I get out of it. My friend, I help them because my friend has a need. No questions asked, no reciprocation. It's just, it's that unconditional love meted out in the form of service. And I'm seeing that happen and develop amongst that younger generation. They almost get it natively. It's almost in their DNA to serve in that way. And that gives me hope, because if we can listen down and learn that, I think we do have a future, and a bright one.
The increasing leadership in our church by people of color gives me hope. But I'm not talking about just in the general church and the regional churches, because like I said, you can have the table and have people invited to sit at the head of it and still own the table. But I'm talking about the overall life of the church, where leaders from communities of color, especially many young leaders now, are boldly speaking up and faithfully working, not only for justice in their communities and in the world, but also for greater and complete, not just greater, but complete equity in a church that actually will form, if it lasts, will form future generations of Christians. They will come out of it differently. They'll go into it differently. They'll make it different, but they want to have a new, hopefully vital, active group of Christians in the future.
This is so encouraging. I'm reminded that another sign of hope is the collaboration that even brought this particular offering into being. And I really see a lot of hope in that. I think, again, one of those meteors, one of those shooting stars that is dying is the way in which we function in silos, right? And it does not work for us at all. So I'm excited about the ways in which Disciples Justice Ministry are working, not just working in collaboration, but modeling collaboration for the broader church.
Being brave together. Each of our 4 videos will end with a tangible takeaway, as something you can do in the work for justice and wholeness. We're calling it Being Brave Together. April Johnson is going to introduce you to an experiential discussion tool that she and the 2020 DPF Peace Interns created together last summer, called A Parallel Journey. Then I'll hop back on and share some ways that you can put that resource to use.
Jesus was not just countercultural, but Jesus offered a counter narrative. We have to be open to promoting Jesus's counter narrative, but all of our stories make that narrative. And so we need to invite new voices to tell their story so that we can dismantle the narratives that we talked about that are examples of our brokenness. Dismantle patriarchy, dismantle human hierarchy that says whiteness is supreme. That is not the end of the story. The end of the story is inviting new voices to share their stories. And some of that comes through training. Some of that comes through experiential opportunities. We have one that we did with Disciples Peace Interns that we actually have on our website and on the DPF's website, a parallel journey where you get to go in and follow a day in the life of someone, so it's interactive. So any ways that we can come up with, or congregation can come up with interactive ways to experience what it's like to create a new narrative, I think is how we work towards healing our brokenness.
April and the 2020 DPF Peace interns, Wendy Davidson, Jennifer Williams, and Raphael Guillen, developed a parallel journey as an interactive, online, choose-your-own-adventure style, anti-oppression Bible study. And it is just as awesome as it sounds. You can find it at bit.ly/a-parallel-journey. In seeking to equip us for the work of dismantling white supremacy, patriarchy, and oppressive systems, a parallel journey lets you follow two different characters through everyday experiences in their lives. You'll see how they're treated differently. Be invited to think deeply about the systems at play here and find the ways that Scripture calls us to faithfully respond. It is a great tool that folks have used in all sorts of ways. You can use it as a personal devotion, walking through the story by yourself, reading through the scripture passages, and journaling about the experience. Others have used it as a small group resource. You can either have everyone in your group click through the experience individually and then talk about their decisions at what they encountered, or you can have the group click through the story one time together, with folks discussing each choice along the way and coming to consensus on what to do next. Either way, there's a discussion guide at the end of the experience ready to help you debrief and process afterward. Oh, and I've even heard of one pastor where they were planning to use a parallel journey for the entire Sunday morning worship service, sharing the experience, sharing the scriptures, and inviting reflections along the way. There are a million ways that you can use this resource in your church. Our hope is that it helps you to have the kinds of conversations that we've talked about in this video. Conversations where we can dig in for the hard work ahead, places where we can name injustice and begin organizing to faithfully overcome it. I want to thank our amazing panel, April, Ken, Alex, and Jack, for the discussion that they shared. You'll find links in the description section of this video on YouTube with more resources as we face brokenness and strive to be brave together. And there'll be 3 more videos coming this summer to complete the series. Let's be brave together, church. Thanks for joining us. Blessings and peace.